So Paul Krugman, as you know, is an economist, a professor of economics at Princeton, and a columnist on the New York Times op-ed page. He was the winner of the 2008 Nobel Prize in Economics for his work on new trade theory and new economic geography. He's the author of more than 20 books and countless articles. He's the subject of even more articles in academic and not, innumerable rants on the internet, and several songs on YouTube, which you should check out. They're pretty great. He recently made a cameo appearance in the movie Get Him to the Greek, playing himself. He is not shy about sharing his opinions, and his columns have enormous influence, with the result that he's both passionately admired and passionately loathed, sometimes by the same people. And I hope by the end of the session you'll see why. So I think we'll focus mostly on what's going on right now. So you've written a lot about how we failed to learn the lessons of the Great Depression. And I was wondering if you could go through in what sense you feel that the administration has learned the lessons of the Great Depression, how we've dealt with this recession differently from the way the Depression was dealt with in the 30s, and how we have not learned the lessons we should have done.
Oh, wow.
That's a big question.
Yeah. So how many hours do we have? No, no, so look, we came in, one of the things that I think people don't really understand is that we came into this mess, this crisis, not understanding everything, but not completely at sea. If you were, if you understood economics the way it was taught in Paul Samuelson, the first edition of Paul Samuelson's textbook, 1948, it actually was a pretty good guide to the kinds of things we're going through now. You might not have predicted the details of the banking crisis, but you did know that banking crises happen. And you knew more or less what the possible policy responses were, what you should be doing. And what they said above all is that what you have in this kind of crisis is you have a situation which the problem is insufficient spending. There's just not enough spending in the economy. And what you need is to use every tool at your disposal, the Federal Reserve, but also the federal spending, to try and pump up demand so as to avoid mass unemployment. The amazing thing is that we didn't use that knowledge. The Obama administration did push through a fiscal stimulus plan, but it was one that right from the beginning you could see was likely to be much too small relative to the size of the problem. And then almost as soon as we passed what I think of as the, oh my God, we're all going to die stage of the crisis. As soon as we were past that, there was this overwhelming push on the part of establishment opinion, on the part of a lot of people in the political process, say, okay, now we need to start cutting back. Now we need to start having austerity because, government deficits are a terrible thing. And that's all wrong. And so what's happened is what we did was enough to avoid all dying, basically. We got through the, oh my God, we're all going to die period and avoided having a full replay of the Great Depression. But at that point, we stalled out. We lost all clarity. And here we are with massive unemployment, very depressed U.S. economy, very depressed world economy, and no political will to do anything about it. So that's, and in that sense, we're very much replaying things that happened in the 1930s. In the 1930s, we had a much worse slump to begin with, but there was a substantial but incomplete recovery up through about 1937. And at that point, orthodoxy reared its head, and FDR was persuaded to cut back and lay off half the people who were being employed by the WPA and so on. And the result was we slid right back into depression. And it's 1937 all over again.
Well, you mentioned not just the government, but the Fed also, and you've been very frustrated with the Fed's passivity in the face of unemployment. And you've pointed out that Bernanke 10 years ago was excoriating Japan for not doing enough to deal with its own recession. Why do you think he's not now being more aggressive?
Well, okay. Background. So when I was hired at Princeton, it was 10 years ago, we actually had a little group of people at Princeton who were very obsessed with the example of Japan. Japan entered its, what we used to call its lost decade. It's now about 18 years. But Japan entered its long period of slump in the early 1990s after housing bubble and a banking crisis, not too different from what we're going through. And that group included me, included Lars Svensson, who's now back in Sweden at the Riksbank, their equivalent to the Fed, and Ben Bernanke. And we're all of us looked at this and said, a lot of people looked at Japan's troubles and said, well, that just shows how messed up the Japanese are. But a lot of us looked at it, or some of us, not a lot, a few people, including Ben Bernanke, looked at it and said, that's a big, rich, stable, advanced economy. And if they can get into that kind of trouble, so could we, because they're not idiots, and they have a lot of freedom of action. And so if this is happening to them, it could happen to us. And so we tried to talk about what we might do. And there were a lot of thoughts about what should be done. And Ben Bernanke, as then Professor Ben Bernanke, wrote pretty caustic critiques of the Bank of Japan for not doing enough. And now that you do now that Ben is heading the Federal Reserve, you can take almost verbatim the things he was saying, criticizing the Bank of Japan for not being more aggressive, for not doing more unconventional policies, and apply them to the Federal Reserve. Some of us have taken to calling him Bernanke-san. And now, I do not know what's really going on. My suspicion is that he knows in his heart that he should be doing more, but he's not a dictator. He has a board. He has the Open Market Committee, which includes some people who are not at all sharing the same point of view. There are people on the Fed board who are afraid that inflation is about to break out, no matter what's actually happening. And so I think it's diplomacy, but it is amazing. I've been saying we basically all need to go and bow and apologize to the Japanese, because we are actually doing worse than they did. We're having the slump, we're failing to deal with it, and we're having mass unemployment, mass suffering in a way that they never did. So we're actually doing substantially worse in dealing with our crisis than the much maligned Japanese did.
Mm-hmm. What about, what do you think at this point about the Tarp Bank bailout? Because it looks like it will cost us less and less.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you still think it would have been a good idea to nationalize the banks, or if you think it worked okay, or?
Okay. So Tarp, the federal government went in and bought up bum assets and provided emergency aid to the banks. And it did so. I wanted a lot more strings attached. So I wanted, in particular, that banks that were really, at least a couple, not all, but a couple of banks that were really on the edge, that had essentially no market value except for the expectation of a government rescue, that the government should have taken ownership temporarily. So that would have been Citigroup and possibly Bank of America. Now, in the end, they have returned to financial health, more or less, without that happening. First of all, we didn't know that was going to happen. So if the fact that it was a gamble, and it was set up as a gamble of heads stockholders win, the tails the taxpayers lose. Now, as this turned out, it came up heads. But still, if the government had taken ownership, it would have actually made money on this thing. And it could have ended up losing a lot of money. Could have ended up like Ireland, where I guess rescuing just one bank is now going to cost the Irish about $12,000 per man, woman, and child in the population of Ireland. And the other thing is, although the banks are no longer in danger of failing, the big ones, still losing about 5 smaller banks a week, but they're still not doing very much lending. Mm-hmm. So one of the things you could have done if you'd taken ownership would have been to recapitalize, put a lot more, basically enhance the financial strength of the banks, which you could have done without it being a subsidy, because at that point the taxpayers would also have been the stockholders, and it would have made them more able to lend. So I think things turned out not as bad as they might have. We could have ended up with taxpayers just holding the bag, and as in the end, it looks like the TARP is going to lose very little money. So that was good, but that doesn't mean it was the right policy, and we didn't. So in a sense, we got lucky there, but that doesn't mean that it was the right thing.
I mean, something else I've been wondering, reading your columns and your blog, is when it came to the healthcare bill that eventually passed was not the bill that you had wanted. It was not perfect by any means. But after kind of wrestling with yourself, you decided this was better than no bill at all, and you decided this is pragmatically the only thing that we can get, and you supported it. And when I talked to people in the administration, they felt that you would help to convince a lot of people that that was the right thing to do, people who really wanted to hold out for single payer or some other option. When it comes to the stimulus, though, I feel that you've been much more frustrated and much less willing to say, you know, that's all they could do given the politics of it.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Mostly, all right. A highly imperfect healthcare bill is likely, I believe, to get better over time. That once you've established the principle of universality, once we become like every other advanced country, once we become a civilized society that guarantees health care to everybody, right?
Right.
No, this is awesome, right? Nobody else does this.
Right.
Then all the pressure is to make the thing more workable, more affordable. So although there's no public option in the plan now, at some point the fact that a public option would save money is going to come to weigh in. At some point, perhaps, the fact that single-payer systems are just a lot cheaper to operate than this kind of Rube Goldberg thing, which runs it through the private insurance companies, might come to prevail. But the point is, I think, unless if we can get through the next couple of years, then universality will be irreversible, and we'll have a system, and then the pressure will be to improve it. On the stimulus, what seemed obvious to me right from the beginning was that if you did it halfway, then it would be branded a failure, and that you had one shot to make it good enough to carry on. That you had to have a stimulus right at the beginning that would deliver a convincing decline in unemployment, so that if you did need to come back for more, you could say, look, it worked, but it didn't work enough. And what they did, facing real political constraints, but never really testing those constraints. But what they did was something that was enough to make things not as bad as they could have been, but not enough to make things convincingly better.
Right.
And that I was tearing my hair out in January 2009 because I could see. I mean, I didn't get everything right, but I was saying, I can see that this will lead to a situation where by the fall, unemployment is still going to be very high. And instead of people saying, oh, the stimulus wasn't big enough, we need more, they're going to say, oh, well, so much for stimulus, and we'll get it. There would be no second chance. And that's how it's played out.
Right. I mean, obviously you've been fairly critical of the current administration. Why do you think Obama has become so unpopular? Do you think it's mostly about the stimulus failing to do what it needed to do, or are there other factors?
So I talked to political scientists, and what the ones I talked to say is that almost everything that political reporters talk about, almost everything you see in a politics analysis, is in fact essentially junk. That what matters is the unemployment rate and the direction of the unemployment rate. That if the economy is good, or if the economy is improving, then the White House and the president will be popular, and if not, not. And that if you had told us in January 2009, when Obama had a very high approval rating, that in October 2010, the unemployment rate would be 9.6% and not improving, that you could have predicted pretty much exactly what the approval rating is. It's results are what matter. A lot of political reporting has these elaborate psychodramas where the public sees this and that, and almost none of that really happens. That happens in the minds of maybe 500 people who are actually paid to follow these things, right? And it doesn't actually happen. Now there's a few other things. There's clearly that's about the overall rating. There's a level of intensity in Obama hatred that I think you can't account for just in terms of the unemployment rate. And that's about various things that go on in the American psyche. There is part of it. I think it's too easy to say it's just about race, because a lot of people here are too young to remember, but you got to remember 1993, 1994, and what the level of crazy Clinton hatred that was out there. But so this is what happens to any Democratic president. But add it to it the fact that we've got a black president, and you get this craziness that goes on. But I think Democrats would be cruising to holding their majorities, and Obama would be viewed as a really successful guy if the unemployment rate were now 8% and falling, not 9.6 and rising.
Right, right. What about the re-regulation of Wall Street, such as it is? What do you think the administration has done that's good, and what would you have done that has not been done?
I have a lot less certainty on these issues than I do on things like the stimulus. Because bank regulation is to some extent a black art, and nobody quite knows. We had about 50 years of real stability in banking after the 1930s, and clearly that had a lot to do with the regulations, but we still don't quite understand entirely why. The regulations, although they were there, don't look quite strong enough to have done what was done. So I'd say I'm not as passionate about this. It was clear that something had to be done. And the legislation that was created is not bad. Some people are really upset because it doesn't do very much to address too big to fail, but I think that was always a bit of a red herring. It's not the size that's the issue. It's look at Canada, which has had a relatively successful. Their banks have weathered the storm pretty well. They basically only have 5 banks. So in Canada, all the banks are too big to fail, but they are well regulated. So that's what mattered. So the bill that came out is potentially fairly good. The only thing I would say is that it relies a lot on discretion. It relies on. It says that systemically important institutions will be subject to special restraints, special requirements for additional capital, for example. But what's a systemically important institution? Well, that's to be decided by the Financial Stability Council. And what's the level of capital that's required? Well, that's going to be decided by the Financial Stability Oversight Council. Which all kind of makes sense, because it is very hard to write things down explicitly, especially because the bankers can afford the most expensive lawyers. And you write anything down in terms of words, and they'll find some way around it. But it does mean that it depends tremendously on having smart, well-intentioned people running things. So my quick summary is this could work fine. Actually, it would probably work okay under current management. I have my criticisms of Tim Geithner and all that, but I still think they would be reasonable. But it won't work at all once President Palin appoints Ron Paul as Treasury Secretary.
Right. You've said that, still on the subject of Wall Street, you've said that you can't really think of any useful financial innovation of the past 20 years other than the ATM. Do you think that investment banks perform any socially useful function?
Okay. Investment, by the way, this is a running game, right? We sort of name a financial innovation that was clearly good, other than ATMs. And it's a game that economists play. It used to be, actually, people would say, well, subprime lending. Investment banks traditionally were basically deal makers. They were putting things together, and there was a lot of technical expertise. So if you look at what Lehman Brothers was doing 30 years ago, that was reasonably productive social function. But most of what has happened since then is that it put shadow banking. This is the term that Paul McCulley at PIMCO came up with it. But anyway, all of these things that are banking under other names, banking that basically avoids the regulations of banking. So everything that is effectively giving some people something that functions a lot like deposits but is not subject to the regulations that depository institutions face, all of that, I think, has turned out to be not really doing anything that good old-fashioned banking wouldn't do, creating a lot of risks that good old-fashioned banking didn't create, and absorbing an incredible amount of resources, talent, I mean, there is something wrong when the best and the brightest of Princeton go off into making, basically making people offers they don't understand on Wall Street.
Right. You've been criticized for making it seem as though anyone who disagrees with you is either an idiot or a knave. And I was wondering if you could prove those critics wrong by playing devil's advocate and giving us the best case argument for why austerity right now for government spending cuts might be a good idea, paying more attention to the deficit.
Okay. By the way, a commenter on my blog said that it's right. Not everybody who disagrees with me is a fool or a knave. Some are both. No, look, if you believe that, if you believe that that fear of the prospect of a runaway deficit and eventual insolvency of the U.S. government is something that's really weighing on people's minds, and if you believe that people will take austerity now as a signal of real willingness to deal with these things, then you can make the case that this is that actually budget cutting is actually going to inflict very little harm on the economy, maybe even boost it. So, I mean, it's not the argument for austerity, even when the economy is depressed, is not something that has to be wrong. It's something that could be right, but there are a couple of things you would expect to see for it to be right. Mm-hmm. The way I put it, you'd expect to see, first of all, that people really were. You expect to see real sign that people were really worried about long-term government finances in a way that is affecting current behavior. So who has the biggest immediate stake in that? And that would be people buying U.S. government bonds. Mm-hmm. So if the U.S. bond yields looked like Greek or even Irish bond yields, I think we would have a real story there. But they don't. Interest rate's about 2.5% on 10-year bonds now. It's the last I looked, the inflation-protected interest rate on 5-year U.S. government bonds was actually negative. Mm-hmm. People don't look like they're at all worried about future government spending. And if you saw other things, if you saw that, if the man in the street seemed to be really saying, I'm afraid to spend because I don't know what's going to happen to the government budget, that would be again a reason to think that austerity might make sense. But you don't see any of those things. And there's something very strange about the way people make these arguments. There's a lot of talk about how historically we've seen that convincing government austerity is expansionary. And then you start to ask for examples, and the examples that are produced one after another turn out to not actually be relevant. There are examples of countries that didn't actually do austerity, or that didn't actually expand, or that clearly had an export boom. So at this point, people like Jean-Claude Trichet, the head of the European Central Bank, talk a lot about the historical evidence for that austerity can actually promote economic growth and in a slump. And people who've gone through the alleged cases have said that the total list of cases that even possibly fit this is as follows: Ireland, 1987. And that one even isn't very good. I mean, there basically is. So the answer. Look, if our public finances, if we looked like Ireland, then I think we could have at least a pretty good case to say that at least that there was no alternative to austerity, but we don't.
That was going to be my next question. So you think that austerity in the case of Ireland and Greece right now is what's required? Well,
there's a fine line. What I actually think in the case of Greece, for sure, is that actually they're past the point where even austerity can work. That is right.
Is there any hope?
The thing that's, I'm making this up as I go along. This latest thing, right? I've got a new. You have to have public finances that are in bad enough shape so that people are really worried, so that you need to convince them through austerity that you're going to do what has to be done, but not in such terrible shape that there really is no alternative to default. And Greece, I think, is on the far side of that line, right? I just don't see I don't see how Greece works. Even the alleged even the IMF plan for Greece, which is for the austerity and how this is all going to work, and which I think is wildly over-optimistic about the economic outlook, actually shows the debt situation getting steadily worse over the next 5 years. So it doesn't
What's going to happen to Greece?
Well, I think they will in the end have a debt restructuring, where they'll pay less of it, and I would put about even odds on them dropping out of the euro. Which is a terrible, you can't do that without tremendous banking turmoil. But my guess is they'll have the banking turmoil anyway, and then that will come along the way. And by history, one of the great things we've learned in this crisis, I mean, there are some silver linings. They're pretty small, but one of them is we really have learned the uses of history. Nobody has done as well in making sense of this and even in calling what was going to happen as people who really know about the 1930s, who really know about crises in other countries. Argentina, 2002, is in a way my model for Greece. It's not perfect. They weren't actually on the dollar. They actually still had their peso, but it was supposedly permanently pegged at 1 peso, $1, and everyone said you can't possibly unpeg it because even to hint that would cause a banking crisis, and they had debt problems. What eventually happened was that they had a banking crisis anyway. They had a massive run on the banks, which basically forced them to close the banks. And it was after the banks were closed that they then went and said, okay, we can't do this anymore, and they allowed the peso to drop to 30 cents. And I think the story I would have here is that about even odds, that the Greek story ends up with a banking crisis and the euro is replaced by the new drachma.
Right. What about coming back to the U.S.? At what point is it acceptable to start talking about austerity again? Like, I guess, at what point in the unemployment rate do you say, okay, we can now stop exclusively worrying about unemployment and start worrying about the deficit?
Yeah, okay. Let me do that in two pieces, because I can actually more or less put numbers to interest rate policy, and then so. If you follow, the Fed, there's been a lot of discussion about, well, actually until a couple of months ago, there was lots of talk about when will the Fed start tightening, and shouldn't it be tightening, and now that's kind of faded out as people have realized just how bad things are. But we have a historical, you can look at what Fed policy has been in the past. There's a pretty good relationship between unemployment and inflation on one side and Fed interest rate policy on the other. The jargon, the Taylor rule. But and if you look at that rule right now, what it says is that the Fed funds rate, the rate the Fed controls, should currently be about minus 5%, which tells you what the problem is, right? You can't actually do that. And you can ask how low would unemployment have to get before the Fed should start to raise interest rates, based on its historical behavior. And the answer is it's probably below 7%. So an unemployment rate below 7%, we could be talking about the Fed raising interest rates. If you're in a situation where the Fed is possibly going to be raising interest rates, then you're also in a situation where you could start cutting back on government support for the economy and sort of make up for that by having the Fed postpone the rate rises. So we could get into a world where we're starting to return to a little bit more normal considerations, and that would include starting some budget tightening when the unemployment rate is down, let's say, in the 7% range. And at the current rate of progress, that will happen never, right? At the current rate of progress, we're likely to see unemployment rising over the next, at least the next 6 months. So, but that's it. I mean, the point is we're a hugely depressed, high unemployment, low inflation, sliding towards deflation economy, and that's not a situation in which you want to be cutting.
Right. On coming away from the government for a minute to actual people's behavior, you've said that on the one hand, the oh my God, we're all going to die moment was kind of too short in the sense that it didn't really change people's way of behaving, that in the Depression people became much more prudent because they learned to fear shortages, and you've said that you're worried that people haven't really learned their lesson from this recession. On the other hand, you've also said that you worry about people becoming too prudent, that if everyone stops spending and starts saving all at once, that worsens the situation. So which do you worry about more, and how do you think about personal behavior?
Right now, I think it's all the concerns are too prudent. I mean, the clear and present danger is unemployment. Mm-hmm. You know, I just want to say that compared with the devastation that high unemployment and high long-term unemployment is wreaking on people's lives right now, costs that we'll pay for decades. Every student who comes out of college and can't find a job, I've know people who are exactly my age who've lost their jobs and fear that they may never work again, right? Everybody in those are huge costs, and what you really want to worry about now is that. The lack of prudence, I mean, yeah, it's a little worrisome that Wall Street seems to have learned nothing, and that the next time we're in the economy is looking at something like health again, it may be prepared to do the whole thing all over again. Which the thing about this crisis was that there were. You would have thought after the dot-com bubble, after long-term capital management, that people would have been more careful, more prudent, but they acted as if nothing could ever go wrong, and you worry that could happen again. But that's going to be a ways off. That is something to worry about, but it's not the clear and present danger. And in fact, if I could find a way to get almost anything that would lead to more spending right now would be a good thing, just because of the damage being done. I mean, as always, The Onion had the best headline. This is a while back, but they had a headline: "A recession-plagued nation demands new bubble to invest in." That's about it.
Right. I mean, on a related subject, you've written often in frustration that it's a real misunderstanding that people have of economics, that it's not a morality play, that it's not about being punished for vice and being rewarded for virtue, like prudence, for instance, is exactly the wrong virtue right now. And I was wondering to what extent you think this misguided moral thinking is responsible for people's aversion to the stimulus, worries about the deficit, Tea Party anger. Do you think it's this kind of moral thinking?
I think it depends who we're talking about. The Tea Party stuff, I believe, has nothing to do. When people say that the Tea Partiers are angry about the deficit, I think they may say that, but they're angry about the deficit, and they also are angry at the prospect of rising taxes and at cuts in Medicare. So there's no actual philosophy there. And in general, at the level of the public, when people say that they're concerned about the deficit, I think you should always heavily discount that and maybe think it's people don't know what the deficit is. They don't know what it is conceptually. They certainly don't know what it is as a number. This is back to my political science colleagues. Larry Bartels at Princeton has this great thing. People were surveyed in 1996 asking what had happened to the deficit under President Clinton. And a plurality of the public and a strong majority of Republicans said that it had gone up. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it had gone way, way down, even by then. So people have no idea what it is. But in the establishment, among the people who are central bank governors or finance officials or editorialists for major newspapers, there is this morality thing, that it's somehow bad to run deficits. It's bad to have cheap money. I don't think you can make sense of the intense desire, clearly on the part of a lot of people at the Fed and even more so at the European Central Bank, to start raising interest rates, except in terms of their sense that it's somehow just wrong to have money so cheap. I forgot to mention when I was talking about the people at Princeton, who 10 years ago, Ben Bernanke and myself, and Lars Svensson, who's now back in Sweden. I just recently learned that he's now fighting with his colleagues at the Swedish Central Bank because they all want to keep raising interest rates, even though Sweden, although they're doing a lot better than we are, is still a quite depressed economy. And so I've had to run some of the reports through Google Translate, so I may be getting some of this wrong. But as best I gather, he's just going wild. He says there's no reason to be raising interest rates. These are basic things, and yet people want to do it. And it's just, I think it's this morality view. And yeah, it's a very natural thing. You feel that bad things must be the result of excess, of being insufficiently hard on yourself and hard on other people, mostly in this case. And that's one of the things that makes this situation we're in so hard, is it is a world in which, well, I've written this a number of times, in which virtue is vice and prudence is folly. It's a world in which what we need is more spending.
Right. I mean, this is sort of a similar question. You've written that current Republican proposals, I guess I'm thinking of Paul Ryan, but in general, and the new pledge for America for balancing the budget while preserving Medicare, Social Security, the military budget, and the Bush tax cuts are just total nonsense. And unlike Republican proposals, say in the Reagan era, which you disagreed with, but had a theory and economics behind them, at least. So what do you think has happened? Are people getting stupider?
That's okay. Wow. I think first of all, one thing you really want to say is if the past seems smarter than the present, it's partly because the really stupid stuff has not come down to us, right? If you think, oh, movies were great in the good old days, that's because we don't watch all those B movies that they were making back in the 30s. No, I think what's happened on the right is, I've written, this is old stuff, but my book from 3 years ago, Conscience of a Liberal, a lot of that was about the rise of movement conservatism, right? There really is a clear set of institutions. There's it's an organized thing there, and above all, it's actually it provides, you can be a professional conservative in a way that's it's kind of funny to have the Obama people complaining about the professional left, because there's not really very much. They can't really make a living on the professional left, but boy, can you make a living on the professional right. And there's a whole set of institutions, think tanks, media organizations, Fox News and so on, that provide basically a universe, a world in which you can live. If you're a politician on the right and things go badly, you will be taken care of. Rick Santorum is now at heads the America's Enemies program. It's some think tank you've never heard of, but it's the usual Coke and Scaife money. And it's actually the term that some of us use is wingnut welfare. But anyway, what's happened now is in 1980, this was all a relatively new thing. When Ronald Reagan was running for president, people who were conservatives were people who were, there were by that time a fair number of professional conservatives, but they'd come into it relatively recently. And so they felt they still had some connection with the wider world standards of consistency and logic and all of that. At this point, you have people who have spent their entire adult lives working in this, and that includes members of Congress, it includes people in the media. So it's this complete sort of hermetic intellectual universe, and it's completely cynical. We are really now in a world of right-wing apparatchiks, who are not at all. It's not like they made a difficult, heart-rending decision about whether to adopt these views in the face of possible unpopularity. They're people who slid into it like into a warm bath when they were 20 years old and have never left. And so the ability and the willingness to spout this, like I wrote, in these budget proposals, the war on terror has given way to the war on arithmetic. And it's not but it doesn't bother them, because this really is, it's not a world in which views are challenged.
But actually, it wasn't a long time ago. I can't remember the name of the article, but when you and I were talking for before you mentioned this Leninist strategy, basically on the right.
That was the Cato Institute's plan to basically to destroy Social Security. That was so. There's a document out there that I think was published. I'm not sure, but it was people at the Cato Institute. It was published about 1981. Because Ronald Reagan sort of made a run at Social Security in 1980 and quickly hit massive popular pushback. And so they went back, wrote this document after the failure of the attempt to dismantle Social Security 30 years ago, saying, okay, we need a long-term Leninist strategy, which was one of a small group has to be really organized, has to use whatever excuse it can, has to and never say what it is that your actual goal is to dismantle Social Security. It's kind of amazing they wrote this as an open document. But this again, these are the early years of what is now the movement. I mean, we're now in the we're actually quite literally in the era now where the sons of the people who created this movement are now the guy. Right? It's William Crystal's son of, John Petaret's son of, and so these are now people who grew up in this whole movement.
Right.
And these people probably have no idea. They wouldn't write a paper about a Leninist strategy because they probably don't know anything about Lenin except that he was evil.
Right. Let's talk about China for a second. At the risk of sounding stupid, this is something that I haven't understood in your various writings, recent writings on this topic. You've written that China keeping its currency artificially undervalued is harming Chinese. It may be helping a few Chinese companies, favored Chinese companies, but it's harming Chinese workers in general. But then you say we should retaliate, and we shouldn't be worried that China is going to retaliate by selling off U.S. bonds and having the dollar depreciate because that would help U.S. workers. So I guess I can't understand how a depreciated currency would harm Chinese workers and help U.S. workers. And I understand that both are both consumers and workers, but how does that work?
Oh, I'm having this overwhelming professorial urge to say, good question.
Thank you.
And the answer is where the economies are in very different conditions. The United States is a depressed economy with mass unemployment, incipient deflation. We're basically in depression conditions. China is a booming economy which is having inflationary problems. They're probably basically lying about the rate of inflation. But it appears to be really taking off there. So they're in a situation where they are not having problems creating jobs. They're having problems, again, the economy is overheating in China. So from there, if we were in that situation, then I would say that a stronger dollar would be good for U.S. workers. But we're not. We're in a situation now where the problem is jobs. And so that's the answer. That's why it's the asymmetry. It's China as an economy which obviously enormously different conditions but more important, just a very different stage of the business cycle.
And what do you think, I mean, in order to, obviously we're trying to, through diplomatic means, to get China to change its policy. If that fails, what would you specifically recommend that we do?
CVDs. Trade policy is full of these three-letter combinations of things, and MFNs and CVDs and so on. Countervailing duties. We actually have a normal, well-established procedure in international trade law that if a country is subsidizing its exports, which is illegal under trade agreements, but what you can do in response is to have a tariff that basically offsets the subsidy, so that you're wiping out the effect of the subsidy, and the only result then is that the foreign government is laying out money which your government is now collecting. It doesn't. The trade law is weirdly murky on what happens if it's a currency issue. If the form of the subsidy is that the country is deliberately keeping its currency undervalued. But the economics is clear. In effect, what China is doing is subsidizing its exports and taxing its imports by keeping the renminbi artificially low. So that in the spirit of the law, anyway, the United States would be fully entitled to have countervailing duties, which is what the bill that the House passed a few days ago says. The Levin bill empowers the administration, doesn't require, but empowers the administration to impose countervailing duties on Chinese exports. And that there would be a huge, if we did it, it would for the next several years create employment for a large number of trade lawyers. Because there's this whole extremely arcane thing about what exactly does the language in Article 15, written in 1947, actually mean. And but clearly the spirit of the law would say that we can do that. And that would, I think that would be a huge shock to the Chinese, and the whole tenor of the negotiations would change.
Mm-hmm. You've always been a strong supporter of free trade, and even to the horror of some of your supporters on the left, a defender of sweatshops. And I was wondering if, at this point, you think that outsourcing jobs abroad is actually hurting American workers, or have you changed your views on that at all?
Actually, so I actually haven't. The principle of the thing is that open world markets are very good and very important for poor countries. They really need to have that access to markets. And a lot of that is going to take the form of what's going to look to us like sweatshop labor. And you're going to say, oh my God, it's really horrible that you have these workers in Central America or in Bangladesh earning these incredibly low wages and working under conditions that are terrible would be completely unacceptable here. But the question you have to ask is, what is the alternative? And so that was the defense sweatshop, saying that it's a lot better for Bangladesh to have millions of workers being paid 55 cents an hour, producing pajamas, basically, for us, than for them to have no alternative whatsoever. Now, it's also always been true that this kind of that importing labor-intensive products is negative, is a bad thing for U.S. workers with low levels of education. That you are, in effect, competing with those workers. And now, 15 years ago, I was arguing that that although this was true, it was a much smaller thing than people imagined. That if you actually did the numbers, it was the effects of the low-wage imports were dwarfed by other things that were going on, and we should work on those other things. That's not as clear-cut now, because world trade has expanded hugely, and especially imports of manufactured goods from low-wage countries have expanded enormously. So if you compare, so I've done this, if you compare the numbers now with the numbers in 1995, there's been a surge in imports of low-wage manufactured goods primarily from China and Mexico, and with Mexican wages being about 15% of U.S. and Chinese wages about 5% of U.S. So those numbers have gotten bigger. It's still better to help U.S. workers in more direct ways. It's still much better to have a bigger earned income tax credit, to have guaranteed health care. Although those things are still more important than anything you could achieve through protectionism. But there is, given that it's hard to get those things, there is some moral ambiguity here. I'd add one more thing, which is that most of the workers who are in the class that are likely to be hurt by imports are actually not in manufacturing industries. They're in the service sector, and they're as it now stands, their wages are hit adversely because when you lose an apparel factory, those workers go out and looking for other jobs, and they're competing with workers who may be someplace else. But we could do quite a lot to improve the working conditions of those service sector workers anyway. I mean, put it this way. I think anything we might likely achieve in improving workers' welfare in the United States through trade restrictions would be substantially smaller than what we would get by unionizing Walmart. Right? It's I mean that's a million workers right there, and exactly the kind of workers that we're worried about. So, but I'm afraid of the idea of generalized import restrictions against low-wage countries. That would be a terrible thing for a large number of people in the world. But as a matter of intellectual honesty, I have to admit that concerns about the impact of those imports on U.S. workers are 2 or 3 times as big now as they were in the early 90s when I was dismissing them. That's interesting. And what about, I mean, a sort of intermediate case between China and Mexico and the U.S., like somewhere like Greece? You've written that, now I didn't know if you were advocating this or if you were just pointing out that one way that Greece could help itself would be for the workers to reduce their wages to the point where they became more competitive. Was that something you were suggesting, or just saying that's economically a way? Well, it's going to have to happen, actually, one way or another. What's going to have to happen is that wages in the troubled European economies will have to fall. Those wages were sustained basically relative to German workers. They were sustained at artificially high levels because there was all this inflow of money, of cheap money, the same thing that was financing the housing boom here. And with that money having dried up, those wages will have to fall one way or another. They could fall, if they had their own currencies, it could fall through a devaluation, which would be quick and would be over with. If not, it has to happen through actual wage declines. And so it's not even do I think it's a good idea or not. It's what has to happen. But it's an incredibly painful process. That's as it now stands. We're going to be looking at high unemployment, grinding wage deflation, which is always a terrible thing to achieve in Greece and Spain, in Ireland for years to come. And I actually get this from Spaniards, Spanish labor organizations contact me and saying, "Why do you want us to cut our wages?" Right. I don't actually want you to, but I don't think there's any other way. So would there ever be a scenario, I mean, you said unionize Walmart, but would there ever be a scenario where in the U.S., if unemployment got high enough that you would think, well, maybe if you reduced the minimum wage, maybe if you didn't unionize? I mean, is there ever a time you would say that? No, because the United States, we have our own currency. So if we have a problem of sort of the overall competitiveness of U.S. labor costs, then we just let the dollar fall. Right. I mean, that's, in fact, in this case, we can't actually, I want the Chinese to make the renminbi rise, which is making the dollar fall in terms of their currency. So no, we don't have that problem. And then if you ask, well, given that, does a fall in the overall level of wages in the United States, would that actually help our situation? The answer is no, it would actually make it worse. Because the biggest underlying problem now is that there's a lot of debt out there. Mm-hmm. And if you suppose you cut everybody's wages by 20%, and then prices would fall by 20% roughly, and then all of the debt would, in real terms, be 20% bigger. Right. So actually, falling wages actually make things worse in the kind of situation we're in, which is another one of those things that every economist ought to understand, but a large part of the profession seems to have done its best to forget. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I guess we're almost at the time when I want to open it up for questions. So, I guess best and worst case scenarios for the next 5 years. To end on an easy question. Yeah. Well, the best case is that, in fact, the economy, best case would be that something comes along that leads to a big no, that's not just something comes along. Yeah, don't stop thinking about tomorrow. If something would come along technologically that would lead to a huge surge of business investment, which actually in the 90s that sort of happened, right? Circa 1992, the economy was looking not as bad as it does now, but has some of the same characteristics, and then information technology came along, and aside from producing all kinds of neat things and pets.com and all of that, what the IT of the 90s produced was this a lot of business investment as companies upgraded their IT systems, as telecom companies laid lots of fiber optic cable, which was exactly what the economy needed to pull out of the Bush 1 slump. So if something like that would come along, that would be the best scenario. It would heal spontaneously. And so what we really need is some transformative technology, something that will make businesses invest even though they have lots of excess capacity.
The New Yorker iPad app? Well,
I was about to say, yeah, I've been saying the iPad doesn't cut it. That would be the best case, but we don't see that actually at the moment.
Right.
I guess you could imagine that after the stunning Democratic victory, well, maybe next month, I don't think so, but maybe in 2012, that there's an opportunity to come back and actually do a really expansionary policy. Mm-hmm. Okay. Worst case, the worst that can happen is, in fact, that we have another wave of troubles in the financial system, and that it turns out that this time we can't even get our act together to do as much in terms of holding the thing together with Scotch tape and rubber bands as we did this time, in which case we really could have Great Depression too. More likely, though, and this is what I really worry, is that we have that the economy looks about the way it does now, or worse, and this just goes on and on and on. That huge unemployment, huge long-term unemployment, just becomes the new normal. Right. And I'm afraid that is kind of my prediction. That's what I think is going to happen. Unless, right. So it's pretty grim.
Well, on
that happy note.
Questions. There are mics. Please come to the mics because it's a pretty big, echoey room. There's one there and one there. So you first.
Yeah. I've always been intrigued by the correlation between the economy and hemlines.
Yeah.
And I'm visiting New York from Pittsburgh, and I've seen a lot of short skirts this weekend. In fact, I've seen some shirt dresses that were so short, it didn't seem like there was any skirt at all. I thought that might be hopeful.
What I would say is that there is one thing you need to bear in mind is rising income inequality. And I think the hemlines have a lot to do with incomes at the very top end of the scale. And I would say almost unfortunately, the people at that end are doing much better than the general population. So anyway, these are different times. If prudence is folly and virtue is vice, although that may not be translated into economic policy, maybe it is being translated into fashion sense.
Professor Krugman, you were an early skeptic of candidate Obama. 2 years in, how would you evaluate his performance versus what you expected on economic policy and the like?
Okay. I was worried. I was worried that he would be, during primary season, I was worried that he would be looking for middle ground where none existed. That he would try to split the difference and build a centrist majority, and that basically he just wouldn't be tough enough. And I'm afraid that's kind of how it's turned out. The situation that he walked into was not at all what one imagined during primary season for the Democratic nomination, because it was much worse. So he came in the aftermath of the failure of Lehman. The economy was really in free fall. And I guess I had hoped that would spur a really hardline response, really tough response. It didn't. Its policy has been intelligent. It's been reasonable. It's been low energy. It's been, and on the political side, they really seem to believe that this kind of extreme hatred, slander, fake scandals, all of this, which a lot of us knew was coming because we remembered 1993, but they seemed to think that things like that only happened to people named Clinton. And so they were taken aback and took a long, long time to actually respond. So I have to say I had hoped for better, but it's been kind of what I feared way back in, say, March, April of 2008.
We all know that Larry Summers is headed back to Cambridge. If President Obama comes calling and asks you to join the team, would you accept?
I would explain to him why it's a really, really bad idea. And let me be absolutely serious about that. First of all, I've got a pretty good perch where I am right now, right? It's not as if nobody hears what I'm saying. Being in that job requires, first of all, that there are some administrative issues involved, and you really don't want me doing those. But more importantly, there's a lot of, inherently, there's bureaucratic intrigue, bureaucratic infighting, palace intrigue, who gets to have the president's ear, that's inevitable. It's inevitable even with a very good, very reasonable president. And so, and I'd be terrible at that. I think I'm actually I probably have a better voice on policy where I am now than I would if I were inside the administration. So I think that would be a really bad idea. And let's hope that the call doesn't come. It won't, because I think I'm known to be sufficiently annoying that it wouldn't happen. Yeah.
Yes, I work for a bank regulator, and a lot of the small businesses and people who are seeking credit have been blame the banks, and then they in turn blame the regulators for tightening credit. And one of my questions is, in my view, credit has become tighter because of the loose lending standards that used to exist. And there are some new accounting rules that have kicked in since that time. But also, as you said, 4 or 5 community banks are failing a week on average. Are banks tightening credit too much? I mean, are the regulators pressing down too hard in that area? And is that having a detrimental impact on the economy?
Yeah. There's probably... The small business credit, the large businesses are not having any problems as far as we can see. Small businesses are, how much of that, I guess the question is how much of that could have been avoided no matter what the regulators were doing. I mean, given how badly things went, how many losses were taken, the banks would probably be cautious anyway. I don't know what more you can do. I don't think that, I just don't think it would be feasible to say, okay, we're just going to completely, we're going to have very loose regulatory standards to encourage credit to go out there. I don't know if there's a good answer here. But I will say, though, that although it's a real thing, lack of credit is a real concern for smaller businesses. It's by no means their prime concern. We actually have the surveys of small businesses taken every month. And what's actually funny, this is the National Federation of Independent Business puts these things out. And every month they release a publication. At the front is their sort of editorial, which says the big problem is excess regulation and fear of the healthcare plan and whatever. And then is the actual results of the survey. And what that says is that what businesses complain about, some are complaining about credit, but almost none about regulation. What they're complaining about is lack of sales. So the best thing we could do for small businesses, sure, we can see if there's some way to get the banks doing a little bit better, but the main thing is boost the economy, and the small business situation would take care of itself.
So if it's a problem that the best and brightest in Princeton go to make incomprehensible offers to people, what would you prefer that they do, and what policy choices do we make to incentivize them to do that?
I would like to see, first of all, public service. Particularly, half my appointment is in the Woodrow Wilson School, and we're supposed to be training people for public service. And it would be nice if the best and brightest were going off to, if they're going into the private sector, if they were going off to companies that actually make stuff. But I don't think that's something you can do with educational incentives. I think
I would like to hope that a combination of better financial regulation, which makes banking more boring and less lucrative, and a general policy of promoting economic recovery would do that.
But it is, so I don't have an easy answer, but I think if we got our general national priorities better, that would probably help the allocation of the best and brightest as well. And then, of course, we have a conflict of interest, because what's good for America might be bad for the endowment. Yeah.
I wanted to thank you in person for keeping such an active blog. It's a daily pleasure reading it. I don't know where you find the time.
Neither do I.
It's got to take a lot of time. Piggybacking off an earlier question, I wanted to ask you where you see yourself in the kind of public sphere. Some of your writings have become more political, less economic in the last year or so. So it's kind of wanted to ask how you see your influence.
I've actually, I guess I have a slightly longer perspective. I've become more economic and less political compared with 6 or 7 years ago. The hardest time for me as a columnist was during the period just before, just after the Iraq War, when I was writing a lot of stuff that had nothing to do with economics because no one else seemed to be willing to say it, and that was extremely unpleasant but it needed to be done, and that was a scary time. I think we've kind of forgotten rather quickly just how scary the atmosphere in this country was. We were pretty close to a new McCarthy era then, and that was ugly. And so now it's mostly economics, but I do mix in some. First of all, it's about policy, so it's political, and then I will write about political stuff. But what can you say? I mean, I think I've got a vantage point. I know some stuff. And it's an opportunity to, I'm just trying to, as best I can, keep the narrative, the story we tell about ourselves on track, which hopefully has some political impact as well, but that's mostly what I'm doing.
And there are layers and layers of that story. I have a two-part question about our general decline that concerns it. Jane Mayer wrote a wonderful article in the August 30th issue about the influence of the Koch brothers, and I thought that was pulling the strings with conservative groups. You mentioned the think tanks, and there seems to be all these corporate hidden agendas, which you rarely get to read about in the New York Times. I wonder how much you're aware of these, and maybe you're censored by the Times, and ultimately, okay, I'm glad to know that.
The Times will not let me use certain words, but
Kevin Phillips talks about the financialization of empires as a prelude to their decline, one after another, Dutch, British, and ours. And then I wonder about the possible currency crash. Chris Hedges talks about that as an ultimate. If the oil goes off the dollar.
Okay.
All right, there you go. That's a lot.
All right. So part one, I've actually written, I think, a fair bit about these. The Jane Mayer article about the Koch brothers was wonderful. But if you've been following this stuff, it wasn't really new. You knew about the Koch brothers, you knew about the Scaife, you knew about Coors. This is integral. I mean, the story of the I wrote about a fair bit in Conscience of a Liberal, the book. The rise of this movement is really it's about 8 billionaire families are underpinning a very large part of it. It's amazing how you see this plethora of think tanks, organizations, committee for the whatever, and look at the funding sources. And it ends up being the same group of people. So this is not, the general picture should not be news to anybody. It's getting more blatant. I think some of us had kind of hoped that the economic crisis and the 2008 election would mark a turning point in a downward turning point in the influence of these organized groups, but it has not, at least so far. Decline of the dollar. Let me just say the business about whether oil is priced in dollars is just it. This is real. Now I can retreat completely into professionalism and just say it is trivial. It's just not important. Whether oil is priced in dollars, well, if they or priced in euros, and I don't think there's really an alternative to it being one of those. Means that they maintain a dollar bank account or a euro bank account, and that has virtually no impact on what matters, because it's not as if the oil countries are sitting on big stacks of greenbacks. They have an account which is backed by reserves, which is an account someplace else, and in the end, there's maybe $1 of actual green stuff for every $100 of in the account. It just doesn't matter. And by the way, I mean, if I'm complaining about the Chinese buying too many dollars, I certainly shouldn't be upset at the prospect that at least the Arab oil states would start buying fewer. So this is not an issue. Could we have an economic collapse? Yeah, I do worry about. See, I don't worry about who's going to use the dollar. I worried about the banana republicization of the United States. If we come to a point where people who believe that you can cut taxes and cut spending, except not on spending on anything that anybody likes, and balance the budget. If those people come to dominate our politics, which looks like a real possibility now, then there can come a point at which we just blow up because we're not prepared to make any reasonable choices.
If someone says the real motivation is about Malthus, that the population is outstripping resources, and at the same time they say, look, I'm a social Darwinist, I interpret natural selection as survival of the fittest, so might makes right. Well, if someone says that, and say that's the motivation I think that's really operating in the world economy today, that Malthus was right and the social Darwinists are right.
Okay. Well, I don't think that's the motivation that's operating. I don't think that the Koch brothers or Newt Gingrich is saying, well, you know, he's got actually a Malthusian model of the world, and all of it is in general. People are not that smart, right? It's not that. I don't think that the motivations. I don't think you need to appeal to secret agendas here. It's all pretty much in the open. Maybe not quite what they say in public, but pretty easy to scope out. So I don't think that's the problem. And in terms of Malthus, Malthus was right for 58 of the past 61 centuries. But unfortunately, the ones he was wrong for were the last 3. And so we were. So I don't think that's an issue. There are real resource issues in the world. There are oil prices are remarkably high, given how troubled the world economy still is. Raw material prices are remarkably high. There is pressure, but that's not the core of what's going on in the world right now.
Hi. I want to start by saying I'm an economics dilettante. You know, all I know is that you're a genius.
Got to go do more study then, because it's not right.
And a hero to many of us. But I want to ask you to talk a little bit about the very, very rich. And this has always been in my mind that people with over $100 million should just be forced to give that money to a general pool that gets redistributed. And I'm just wondering if you could comment, even on it's politically unfeasible that would ever happen, I think. But right. If it did ever happen, would that be a solution economically? I do a lot of research among the very, very rich, and it seems so amazing to me, the excess and the polarization of wealth. And I think I've read that very rich are getting even richer right now.
Wow, yeah.
And there are a lot more of them at that super high echelon. Would there ever be a solution in a cap on wealth?
Yeah. The economist in me says that you never want to have a point where you basically have 100% taxation at the margin. That just creates crazy incentives. But it is interesting that we have we have a progressive tax system, but the top rate kicks in at whatever it is, 300-something thousand, depends on family and all. But it used to be there were more gradations above that. I think there's a quite good case for at least having another another tax rate that kicks in for people with more than $1 million a year in income. So I think that the sort of more moderate, reasonable, although it would need denounced as socialism, communism, whatever, it would need to have another one or two tax brackets further up the scale. It is worth remembering that back when we had real socialist presidents like Dwight Eisenhower, at that point the top marginal tax bracket was 91%. Hardly anybody was in it. But I think that would come closer to what you're talking about, and I think there would be less. If we had a steeper scale, there would even pre-tax income, there would be fewer people in that incredibly high bracket because people contemplating acquiring that second $100 million might say, is this really what I want to do with my life? And if that would be a terrible thing if you thought that on average people who acquire that second $100 million were doing great things for society, but I think we've gotten a pretty good lesson that that's mostly not true. But the other thing, effective financial regulation. If you actually look, where are the ranks of the super, super rich coming from? Finance is a disproportionate share. You should really ask, who are these people? There is resource money. There are various, but the bulk of the new huge fortunes have been created by people doing essentially incomprehensible things in the financial industry, and incomprehensible and more to the point, socially dubious things in the financial industry. So if we could bring that under control, we might have a better situation all around here.
Professor Krugman, in the last few years, you and others have inspired me to go back and read some original Keynes.
Yeah.
And I was thinking the other day, I wonder, despite all its faults, if China will not be seen as the real Keynesian in this situation, where they actually saved in good times and then spent out of that deficit in the bad times.
Oh yeah, I mean, China has actually been, in many ways, model Keynesian policies. Not only that they saved in good times and spent in bad times, but that they did a massive, fast fiscal stimulus when the world slump hit. They were able to. They did a lot of infrastructure spending very quickly. Now it helps if you don't have to get things through a legislature and you don't worry at all about corruption in the contracting process and sort of. And so they have certain advantages in doing that. But they did in fact do a big fiscal stimulus, and their currency policy is when you're in Keynesian conditions, when you're in conditions of a depressed economy and zero interest rates, then mercantilism, promoting your exports at other people's expense, it becomes a desirable policy. Except, of course, that if it turns into a war of all against all. So the Chinese now they've actually pursued it too far, because at this point they're no longer suffering from a depressed economy; they're suffering from an overheating economy. But sure, it's. By the way, this comes back to the whole business about economics not being a morality play. That you don't have to like the Chinese regime. You don't have to think that we should have a one-party state to say that, well, okay, but their fast stimulus spending, their use of an undervalued currency to promote exports have in fact boosted their economy. And so, yeah, I actually had this a couple of days ago. I was someone in the German edition of Keynes's General Theory. he wrote that, this is 1937, I guess, that the German government at the time was in fact implementing policies that were kind of in line with the recommendations of the book. And people sometimes go, so see, Keynesianism is about being like Hitler. Keynes himself said it. But it's not. It was an evil, evil regime, which was, in fact, however, pursuing an economic policy that led to full employment long before that of democratic nations.
In this morning's New York Times, there was an article about how the popularity among the T-publicans of these books by von Hayek and some others, as though reporting on it as though this were kind of a new thing, when in fact, you know, having come from Florida and lived through a Jeb Bush governorship, right. I understood a long time ago that basically the Republican Party, certainly in Florida, if not elsewhere, had been taken over by economic libertarians who followed Mises and von Hayek. And what I would like is for, my sense is, but not being an economist or trained in that way, is that they've been discredited over historically. But what I would like is some verbal tools from you to respond to some of these things.
So, well, so I mean, it's true that they've always talked about this stuff, but it's only since Glenn Beck began promoting von Hayek that Road to Serfdom became #1 on whatever it is in business and economics reading on Amazon. So the thing about Road to Serfdom, actually, there was I was just reading a very good discussion of that online. The Road to Serfdom was written originally in 1944, and he was basically saying that if the then Labour Party in Britain got to implement its plans of universal health care and unemployment insurance, that this would lead to a totalitarian regime. And Labour did, in fact, win big in the 1945 elections and implemented all that. And you can just see, right, how totalitarian Britain is right now. I mean, if there's ever been an analysis that has been so thoroughly discredited by events, it's hard to think of one. Now, if you buy Hayek right now, you'll buy what is a much later edition, where he essentially changed the language to make it seem that he had never actually made that prediction. But he did. And that's it. I mean, this is it just. I mean, although I could go on, but that's the. But there's another line. I'm getting a little punchy here, but the other thing is, of course, Ayn Rand. People are in there. I saw a great. Someone talked about there are 2 novels that bookish 14-year-olds read. One of which is Lord of the Rings, and the other is Atlas Shrugged, and how and one of those novels can lead to permanent damage to your personality because you end up warped by the unrealistic characters and a totally screwed up version of the world, and the other involves orcs.
We can have one more question.
Probably the biggest stimulus program in the history of our country, most effective, was World War II. We have a pretty expensive war going on right now, but maybe the scale is a little not adequate. It's pretty clear that our country has been able to go to war on the flimsiest of pretexts. Iraq is what I have in mind. People used to say that World War I was impossible before it happened.
Right.
Can you reassure me that another world war might not be a great way out?
Again, economics is not a morality play. The thing about wars is that they cause all of the usual objections to large-scale government spending to be put aside. So all the people who opposed the Works Progress Administration on the grounds that it was irresponsible fiscally suddenly said, oh, by all means, when it came to spending massive amounts on tanks and warships. And so World War II ended up being the fiscal stimulus the adequate fiscal stimulus that even FDR was never able to get in the 1930s. So that's why war does it. And there is a scale. I mean, Afghanistan and Iraq are combined still under 1% of GDP spending. World War II at its peak was 42% of GDP. And although you didn't need all of that to restore full employment, you probably did need what had happened even before Pearl Harbor, which was about a 15% of GDP rise in military spending. So, what we're getting now is not remotely on that scale. So war is not the necessary answer, but war is the way it has happened in the past. I was looking at my TiVo listings a few weeks ago, and there was some middle-of-the-night old science fiction movie about how scientists invent a fake alien threat to lead to world peace. And I was thinking, maybe we can invent a fake alien threat requiring a buildup to lead to full employment. Because obviously, even now, given the choice between not having had World War II and having had the Great Depression drag on, it would still have been better to let the Great Depression drag on. But what we need is, meow, moral equivalent of war, something that would lead us to spend on a scale to actually produce prosperity. And again, my grimness comes from the fact that I see nothing like that on the horizon.
Thank you very much, Paul, for grouping.
Thank you.